The Russian capital was rocked by a devastating car bomb explosion early Monday morning that claimed the life of one of Moscow's senior military commanders, sending shockwaves through the Russian military establishment and raising serious questions about the security apparatus protecting high-ranking officers even in the heart of the nation's capital. Lieutenant General Fanil Sarvarov, a 56-year-old veteran military officer who held the critically important position of head of the Russian Armed Forces Operational Training Directorate, became the latest victim in what appears to be a systematic campaign of targeted assassinations against Russian military leadership. The explosion occurred on Yasenovaya Street in Moscow's Orekhovo-Borisovo, Yuzhnoye district, a residential area in the southern part of the city where the general apparently resided or frequently traveled. Witnesses in the neighborhood reported hearing a massive blast that shattered windows in nearby apartment buildings and sent residents rushing to their balconies and windows to see what had happened. The scene that greeted first responders was one of complete devastation, with the general's vehicle reduced to a twisted, burning wreck of metal and debris scattered across the street. Emergency medical teams arrived within minutes of the explosion and found General Sarvarov alive but critically injured, having sustained severe trauma from the blast that had torn through his vehicle with devastating force. He was immediately rushed to a nearby hospital where medical staff worked frantically to save his life, but despite their best efforts, the injuries proved too severe and the general succumbed to his wounds shortly after arrival, marking yet another high-profile casualty in what has become an increasingly dangerous conflict that now regularly reaches into Russian territory itself. The method of the assassination speaks to a level of sophistication and planning that has characterized several recent attacks on Russian military and intelligence figures, with investigators quickly determining that an explosive device had been carefully planted underneath General Sarvarov's vehicle, positioned in such a way as to maximize the lethal force directed upward through the floor of the car when detonated. This placement suggests intimate knowledge of the general's vehicle, his routine movements, and the security measures or lack thereof that surrounded his daily activities. The bomb appears to have been remotely detonated at a moment calculated to ensure the general would be in the vehicle, indicating that whoever carried out this operation had been conducting surveillance on their target, tracking his movements and waiting for the optimal moment to strike. Russian security services immediately descended on the scene, cordoning off several blocks around the explosion site as forensic teams began the painstaking work of gathering evidence, documenting the blast pattern, and searching for any clues that might lead them to those responsible. The Investigative Committee of Russia, the country's primary law enforcement agency for serious crimes, announced that it had opened a criminal investigation under charges of murder and illegal trafficking of explosives, though the announcement carried the unmistakable implication that this was no ordinary criminal matter but rather an act of what Russian authorities would characterize as terrorism or warfare carried out by hostile intelligence services. Investigators stated publicly that they were pursuing multiple lines of inquiry, carefully hedging their official statements, even as they made clear where their suspicions lay by specifically mentioning the possibility that the attack was linked to Ukrainian special forces or intelligence services, a characterization that immediately placed this assassination in the context of the ongoing war rather than treating it as an isolated criminal incident. This targeted killing represents the third time in just over a year that a Russian general has been killed by a car bomb, establishing a disturbing pattern that reveals serious vulnerabilities in Russia's ability to protect its senior military leadership, even within the supposed safety of the nation's capital. In April of this year, Lieutenant General Yaroslav Moskolik was killed in a similar car bomb attack, while in December of last year, General Igor, who headed Russia's radiation, chemical, and biological defense forces, was assassinated in an explosion outside his Moscow apartment building, an attack that Ukraine's security service openly claimed responsibility for in a rare public acknowledgement of what Western intelligence officials had long suspected was an ongoing Ukrainian campaign of targeted killings deep inside Russian territory. The fact that these assassinations continue to occur with apparent regularity despite what one would assume would be heightened security measures following each incident raises profound questions about either the capabilities of those carrying out these operations or serious gaps in Russian counterintelligence and protective security protocols. Each of these generals held positions of significant importance within the Russian military hierarchy, making them valuable targets not just for the symbolic impact of killing senior officers but for the operational disruption such assassinations can cause, creating vacancies in crucial positions, forcing organizational reshuffling, and potentially deterring other officers from taking on high-profile roles where they might become targets themselves. General Sarvarov's military career spanned more than 3 decades and encompassed virtually every major conflict in which Russian forces had been engaged since the collapse of the Soviet Union, making him a figure who embodied the institutional knowledge and combat experience that the Russian military relies upon to train and prepare its forces for modern warfare. His service record included participation in the brutal Chechen wars of the 1990s, conflicts that became defining experiences for an entire generation of Russian military officers and that shaped Russian military doctrine and counterinsurgency tactics that would be applied in subsequent conflicts. He also served during the Alsatian-Ingush conflict, one of the many ethnic and territorial disputes that erupted across the former Soviet space in the chaotic years following the USSR's dissolution. More recently, Sarvarov had served in Syria between 2015 and 2016, a deployment that gave him first-hand experience with the kind of combined arms operations, air-ground coordination, and urban warfare that would later characterize much of the fighting in Ukraine. Most significantly, for understanding why he might have been targeted, General Sarvarov had been deeply involved in Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine that began in February 2020, contributing his expertise and experience to what has become the largest conventional military conflict in Europe since World War II. His position, as head of the Operational Training Directorate, a role he had held for 9 years since 2016, placed him at the center of Russian efforts to prepare, train, and educate the next generation of military officers and to develop the operational concepts and tactical doctrine that Russian forces employ on the battlefield. The significance of his role cannot be overstated, as the Operational Training Directorate serves as the intellectual heart of the Russian military, responsible for analyzing lessons learned from ongoing conflicts, developing training programs that incorporate these lessons, and ensuring that Russian forces across all branches maintain a consistent level of operational competence. In a military that has suffered significant casualties in Ukraine and has been forced to mobilize hundreds of thousands of additional troops with varying levels of training and experience, the work of ensuring effective training programs becomes even more critical to maintaining combat effectiveness. Sarvarov would have been intimately involved in assessing Russian military performance in Ukraine, identifying tactical and operational deficiencies, and working to correct them through improved training protocols. He would have had access to detailed assessments of what was working and what wasn't on the battlefield, making him a repository of institutional knowledge about Russian military capabilities and vulnerabilities. From a Ukrainian perspective, targeting such a figure could serve multiple purposes beyond simply eliminating one individual, as it disrupts the continuity of knowledge transfer within the Russian military, creates uncertainty and fear among senior officers who might be targeted next, and sends a powerful message that nowhere is truly safe for those involved in prosecuting the war against Ukraine. Even in the heart of Moscow itself, President Vladimir Putin was immediately notified of General Sarvarov's death through special services channels, an indication of the seriousness with which the Kremlin views these attacks on senior military personnel and the potential implications for both military operations and domestic security. The fact that the Russian president receives immediate notification of such incidents demonstrates that these assassinations are treated as matters of the highest state importance rather than routine security incidents. For Putin, each successful attack on a senior military or intelligence figure within Russian territory represents both a tactical loss and a symbolic defeat, undermining the narrative of Russian strength and security that the Kremlin has worked assiduously to maintain throughout the war. The Russian leadership faces a delicate balancing act in responding to these incidents, needing to acknowledge what has happened without creating panic or appearing vulnerable, while also presumably intensifying security measures and counterintelligence efforts to prevent future attacks. The challenge lies in the nature of the threat itself, as these operations appear to be carried out by individuals or small teams who can blend into the civilian population, who have access to sophisticated explosives and remote detonation technology, and who possess detailed intelligence about their targets' movements and routines. The pattern of targeted killings extends beyond just these three generals to encompass a broader campaign that has struck at various figures within the Russian military and security establishment, including lower-ranking officers, defense industry officials, propagandists, and collaborators in occupied territories. While Ukraine has officially claimed responsibility for some of these operations, others remain formally unacknowledged even as circumstantial evidence and Western intelligence assessments point to Ukrainian involvement. This campaign represents a significant evolution in how modern warfare is conducted, blurring the lines between conventional military operations, special forces actions, and intelligence operations in ways that create complex legal and ethical questions. From a Ukrainian perspective, these operations can be justified as legitimate military action against enemy combatants who are actively involved in prosecuting an illegal war of aggression against Ukraine, targeting individuals whose decisions and actions directly contribute to Ukrainian casualties and suffering. From a Russian perspective, these are acts of terrorism targeting civilians on Russian soil regardless of their military positions, and representing a dangerous escalation that brings the war directly into Russian cities in ways that most ordinary Russians have been largely insulated from despite nearly 3 years of conflict. The assassination also highlights the sophisticated intelligence capabilities that Ukraine has developed or maintained despite being the smaller and ostensibly weaker party in this conflict, demonstrating an ability to identify targets, gather intelligence on their movements and security arrangements, recruit or insert operatives into Russian territory, supply them with explosives and detonation equipment, and coordinate operations that strike at the heart of Moscow's security apparatus. This capability likely reflects a combination of Ukrainian intelligence services' own expertise, assistance from Western intelligence partners who have provided training and perhaps targeting information, and the exploitation of networks within Russia itself that may include Russian citizens opposed to the war, members of ethnic minority groups with grievances against Moscow, or simply individuals motivated by financial incentives. The logistics of such operations are considerable, requiring the acquisition or manufacture of explosives, their transport into Russia without detection, the identification of opportunities to plant devices on target vehicles, and the ability to surveil targets and remotely detonate explosives at the appropriate moment, all while evading Russia's extensive security services and surveillance capabilities. The fact that these operations continue to succeed suggests either that Ukrainian and possibly Western intelligence have developed effective tradecraft for operating in denied areas, or that Russian counterintelligence capabilities have significant blind spots that can be exploited by determined adversaries. The broader context of this assassination includes the ongoing intense fighting along the front lines in Ukraine, where Russian forces continue to make incremental gains in the Donbas region while suffering heavy casualties, and where Ukrainian forces struggle to maintain defensive positions while awaiting promised Western military aid and facing shortages of ammunition and personnel. The war has reached a critical juncture as both sides position themselves for potential negotiations that may be pursued by the incoming Trump administration in the United States, with territorial control and military momentum potentially playing crucial roles in determining the terms of any eventual settlement. In this context, operations like the assassination of General Sarvarov serve multiple strategic purposes beyond the immediate tactical effect of eliminating one senior officer. They demonstrate that Ukraine retains offensive capabilities and the initiative in certain domains. Even if hard-pressed on conventional battlefields, they complicate Russian military planning by forcing the allocation of resources to protection of senior personnel, and they maintain pressure on Russian leadership by making clear that involvement in the war carries personal risks that extend beyond the battlefield. The psychological impact of such operations on Russian military leadership should not be underestimated, as senior officers must now factor personal security concerns into their daily routines, potentially affecting their willingness to take on certain positions or their effectiveness in roles that require freedom of movement and public engagement. Looking ahead, this assassination will almost certainly prompt intensified Russian security measures around senior military and intelligence officials, potentially including changes to residential arrangements, transportation protocols, and public appearances. Russian counterintelligence services will undoubtedly increase efforts to identify and neutralize Ukrainian intelligence networks operating within Russia, potentially leading to arrests, show trials, and heightened surveillance of populations deemed potentially disloyal. The incident may also factor into Russian calculations about escalation, with hardliners potentially arguing that such attacks justify more aggressive military action against Ukrainian infrastructure, leadership targets, or civilian areas in retaliation. However, Russia has already been conducting extensive strikes against Ukrainian cities and infrastructure throughout the war, leaving limited room for meaningful escalation short of using weapons of mass destruction, a step that would carry catastrophic international consequences. The death of General Sarvarov thus becomes one more data point in a conflict that continues to evolve in unexpected directions, demonstrating that modern warfare encompasses not just battles between conventional military forces but sophisticated intelligence operations, targeted killings, cyber warfare, economic pressure, and information campaigns, all of which interact in complex ways to shape the trajectory and ultimate outcome of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine.